Broken chains of fate. Fleeing an unwanted marriage, Lady Beatrice of Blackmere sought shelter in the frozen lands of Sir Geoffrey de Moray, a knight long thought to be dead. He stood before her, arms crossed, watching her with wary curiosity. "You have entered my domain, my lady," he murmured. "Now you must answer for it." Chapter 1. The Falcon's Flight. The wind, a brutal, unforgiving hand, clawed at Lady Beatrice of Blackmere's cloak as she urged her mare onward. Snow, fine and stinging, whipped around them, blurring the already fading light of the winter afternoon. Behind her, Blackmere Castle, her prison for the last 20 years, receded into the swirling white, a dark, ominous shape swallowed by the storm. She could almost hear the furious shouts of her brother, Lord Edmund, echoing on the wind, his rage a palpable force even at this distance. He would be incandescent, finding her gone, the marriage contract, so carefully negotiated with the odious Lord Ashworth, now worthless. Beatrice pressed her heels into the mare's flanks, a desperate plea for speed. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the layers of wool and fur that swathed her. It wasn't the fear of the storm, though it was fierce enough to freeze the marrow in one's bones. It was the fear of capture, of being dragged back to Blackmere, of being forced to wed a man whose cruelty was a whispered legend throughout the land. Ashworth, with his cold, calculating eyes and hands that rumor painted with the blood of his first wife. She had planned this escape for weeks, hoarding scraps of food, bribing a stable boy with a silver locket that had belonged to her mother, the last tangible piece of a life before Blackmere became her gilded cage. The locket, depicting a soaring falcon, felt like a symbol of her own desperate flight. The stable boy, young and wide-eyed, had sworn to keep her secret, but fear had flickered in his gaze. He knew, as she did, the price of defying Lord Edmund. Her escape route was perilous, leading her north, towards the desolate, windswept lands bordering the Moray Firth. Lands whispered to be haunted, ruled by a ghost, a knight long thought dead Sir Geoffrey de Moray. The Winter Lord, they called him, a figure shrouded in myth and rumor. Some said he had died in battle years ago, his body lost to the unforgiving sea. Others claimed he lived still, a recluse, his heart as frozen as the lands he commanded. Beatrice had dismissed these tales as peasant superstition until desperation drove her to reconsider. Her old nursemaid, Elspeth, a woman steeped in the lore of the Highlands, had spoken of a hidden sanctuary in the Moray lands, a place of refuge for those fleeing injustice. Elspeth had given her a crudely drawn map, pressed into her hand with a whispered blessing and a warning. "The Winter Lord is a dangerous man, my lady, but he is also a man of honor. If he offers you shelter, accept it, but be wary, for his price may be high." The map was now clutched in Beatrice's numb fingers, the parchment crinkling with the force of her grip. The landmarks, a twisted oak, a standing stone carved with a serpent, a stream that ran red with iron or were barely visible through the snow. Doubt gnawed at her. Was she chasing a phantom, a legend born of desperation and wishful thinking? The mare stumbled, nearly throwing Beatrice from the saddle. She clung on, her heart hammering against her ribs. The wind howled like a banshee, and the snow fell thicker, obscuring the path ahead. She was lost, alone, and the cold was beginning to seep into her bones, a numbing, insidious embrace. Just as despair threatened to engulf her, she saw it. A faint glow, a flickering beacon in the swirling white. It was a light, emanating from a cluster of buildings nestled in the shadow of a towering cliff. Smoke curled from chimneys, a promise of warmth and shelter. Hope, fragile but persistent, surged through her. She urged the exhausted mare towards the light, her body aching, her spirit weary. As she drew closer, she could make out the shapes of the buildings: a sturdy stone keep, a smaller hall, a stable, all enclosed within a high wall. This was no ruin, no crumbling remnant of a forgotten past. This was a place of life, of habitation. She reached the gate, a massive oak structure reinforced with iron. It was closed, barred against the storm and any unwelcome visitors. Beatrice dismounted, her legs stiff and unsteady. She raised her fist and hammered on the wood, the sound swallowed by the wind. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, a small panel in the gate slid open, revealing a pair of wary, watchful eyes. A gruff voice, roughened by the wind, spoke. "Who seeks entry to Moray?" Beatrice drew herself up, summoning the last vestiges of her noble bearing. "I am Lady Beatrice of Blackmere," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I seek shelter from the storm and from those who would pursue me." The eyes narrowed, scrutinizing her.
"Blackmere? You are far from your lands, my lady."
"I am fleeing an unwanted marriage," Beatrice said, her voice gaining strength. "I seek the protection of Sir Geoffrey de Moray." There was a long silence. Then the panel slid shut. Beatrice held her breath, her fate hanging in the balance. Had she made a terrible mistake? Had she traded one prison for another? The heavy bolts of the gate were drawn back with a groan of protesting metal. The gate swung inward, revealing a courtyard filled with swirling snow. Standing just inside, silhouetted against the flickering torchlight, was a tall, imposing figure. He was clad in dark furs, his face obscured by the shadows of a deep hood. He stood before her, arms crossed, watching her with wary curiosity. "You have entered my domain, my lady," he murmured, his voice low and resonant, carrying a hint of steel beneath the velvet. "Now you must answer for it." The wind seemed to whisper around his words, adding an edge of unforgiving coldness, leaving her to wonder what price she'd have to pay for the sanctuary in the snow. Chapter 2. Sanctuary in Ice. The man who stood before her was even more imposing up close. Though the deep hood shadowed his face, Beatrice could sense the raw power that emanated from him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that filled the courtyard, making the swirling snow seem to defer to his will. The furs he wore, dark and thick, spoke of a life lived in harsh conditions, a life far removed from the silken comforts of Blackmere. "Answer for it?" Beatrice repeated, her voice a little shaky despite her efforts to sound composed. "I have done nothing wrong, sir. I am merely seeking shelter." He stepped closer, the movement fluid and controlled, like a predator approaching its prey. The torchlight flickered across his face, momentarily illuminating a strong jaw, a high-bridged nose, and eyes that gleamed with an unnerving intensity. They were eyes the color of glacial ice, cold and piercing, yet holding a flicker of something else: curiosity, perhaps, or even a hint of weariness. "This is Moray land," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. "I am its lord. All who enter owe me an explanation and a service." Beatrice straightened her spine, drawing on the ingrained pride of her lineage. "I am Lady Beatrice of Blackmere," she repeated, emphasizing her title. "I am fleeing a forced marriage to Lord Ashworth, a man known for his cruelty. I seek your protection, sir." She trailed off, realizing she didn't even know his name, though the evidence was stark before her. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that was both acknowledging and dismissive. "You may call me Moray," he said. "And you believe I am obliged to offer you sanctuary simply because you are a lady of noble birth?" His tone was challenging, testing her. Beatrice met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I believe you are a man of honor, Sir Geoffrey de Moray," she said, the name a calculated risk. "Or so I have been told." The effect was immediate. A flicker of surprise, quickly masked, crossed his face. His eyes narrowed, studying her with renewed intensity. "Who told you that name?" "It is a name whispered in these lands," Beatrice replied, choosing her words carefully. "A name associated with justice, with refuge for those in need." She deliberately avoided mentioning Elspeth, knowing the old woman would be vulnerable if her involvement were known. Moray was silent for a long moment, the only sound the howling of the wind and the crackling of the torches. The snow swirled around them, creating a curtain of white that separated them from the rest of the world. Beatrice felt a shiver run down her spine, not entirely from the cold. This man, this winter lord, was dangerous. but he was also her only hope. Finally, he spoke, his voice devoid of any warmth. "You are bold, Lady Beatrice, and perhaps foolish. I offer no sanctuary lightly. My lands are harsh, my rules unyielding. I am not afraid of hardship," Beatrice said, her voice firm. "I have endured much already." She thought of the endless, suffocating days at Blackmere, the constant fear of her brother's temper, the looming threat of Ashworth's arrival. This frozen wilderness, with all its dangers, was preferable to that. Moray studied her for another long moment, his gaze unwavering. Then he gave a curt nod. "Very well. You may stay. For tonight. But on my terms." He turned and gestured towards a keep.
Come.
"We will speak further within." Beatrice followed him, her mare trailing behind, led by a silent, fur-clad guard who had emerged from the shadows. The courtyard was surprisingly large, enclosed by high stone walls that offered protection from the wind. Several buildings were clustered within, their roofs thick with snow. The keep itself was a formidable structure, its walls thick and imposing, built to withstand both the elements and any human assault. They entered through a heavy wooden door, which was immediately bolted behind them. Beatrice found herself in a large, dimly lit hall. A fire blazed in a massive hearth at one end, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and something else, a subtle, earthy fragrance that she couldn't quite place. Several men were gathered around the fire, their faces turned towards her with curiosity. They were a rough-looking lot, clad in leather and furs, their hands calloused, their faces weathered. Warriors, all of them, she guessed, loyal to the Winter Lord. Moray gestured towards a heavy wooden chair near the fire. "Sit," he commanded. Beatrice obeyed, sinking gratefully into the chair. The warmth of the fire began to thaw her frozen limbs, but her unease remained. She was in the heart of a stranger's stronghold, surrounded by his men, her fate entirely in his hands. Moray stood before her, his back to the fire, his face still partially obscured by the shadows of his hood. "Now, Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice low and measured. "Tell me everything. Why you have fled Blackmere, what you expect from me, and what you are willing to offer in return." Beatrice took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. She knew she had to be honest, but also cautious. She had to convince this man, this enigmatic Winter Lord, that she was worthy of his protection. Her life, quite literally, depended on it. The fire crackled, throwing dancing light across his unreadable expression, the silence before she spoke stretching into an eternity of its own. Chapter 3. The Winter Lord's Decree. Beatrice began her tale, choosing her words with care, painting a picture of life at Blackmere, of her tyrannical brother Edmund, and the looming dread of the arranged marriage to Lord Ashworth. She spoke of Ashworth's reputation, the whispers of cruelty and violence that clung to his name like a shroud. She didn't flinch from the truth, even when it painted her own family in a less than flattering light. "Edmund cares only for power and coin," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "He sees me as nothing more than a pawn in his games of alliance. Ashworth offered him a substantial dowry and a strategic advantage against our rivals, the MacGregors. My wishes, my fears, they were of no consequence." Moray listened in silence, his icy gaze fixed on her face. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer any words of sympathy or encouragement. He simply observed, like a hawk watching its prey, assessing its every move, its every weakness. She described her desperate planning, the bribed stable boy, the precious locket sacrificed, the perilous journey through the storm. She spoke of Elspeth's whispered tales of the Winter Lord, of a sanctuary in the Moray lands, a place where justice and honor still held sway. When she finished, the hall was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. The men around the hearth watched her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. They were loyal to Moray, she knew, and would be wary of any outsider, especially one who brought trouble in their wake. Moray remained silent for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Beatrice felt a bead of sweat trickle down her temple, despite the chill in the air. She had laid bare her soul, her vulnerability, to this man. Now, her fate rested on his judgment. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and resonant, filling the hall. You have told a compelling tale, Lady Beatrice. A tale of desperation and defiance. But tales can be spun. Truths can be twisted. How do I know you are not a spy, sent by your brother or by Ashworth himself? The accusation hung in the air, heavy and chilling. Beatrice met his gaze directly, her chin lifted. I am no spy, Sir Geoffrey. I swear it on my mother's memory, on all that I hold sacred. His eyes narrowed slightly. Oaths can be broken as easily as they are sworn. He paused, then added, his voice taking on a harder edge. And you have already broken your betrothal oath, have you not? Beatrice flinched, but she didn't look away. That oath was forced upon me. It was never freely given. I would rather die than be bound to a man like Ashworth. Moray studied her for another long, tense moment. Then he turned to his men, addressing them without taking his eyes off Beatrice. What say you, Hamish? Do you believe her? A burly, red-haired man stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. She has the look of a Blackmere, my lord. Proud, stubborn, and desperate. But I see no deceit in her eyes. Moray nodded, then turned to another man, a lean, dark-haired fellow with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow. And you, Gareth? The storm was fierce tonight, my lord, Gareth said. No one would brave such weather unless driven by a powerful need. She speaks of Ashworth, his reputation precedes him. I believe she is fleeing for her life. Moray considered their words, his face impassive. Then he turned back to Beatrice, his gaze piercing. You have heard the opinions of my men. They are divided. But the final decision rests with me. He paused, drawing out the suspense. Beatrice held her breath, her heart pounding. I will offer you sanctuary, Lady Beatrice, he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. But on my terms. You will remain here, at Moray, as my ward. You will obey my commands, follow my rules, and offer your services to this household as I see fit. Beatrice felt a surge of relief, quickly tempered by a new wave of apprehension. Your ward? She repeated. What services do you require? You are skilled in needlework, I presume? Moray asked, a hint of a challenge in his voice. You will mend our clothes, our banners. You will assist in the kitchens, in the stillroom. You will learn the ways of this household, and you will contribute to its upkeep. Beatrice swallowed her pride. It was a far cry from the life of leisure she had known at Blackmere, but it was a price she was willing to pay for her freedom. I am willing to work, Sir Geoffrey, she said. I am not afraid of hard labor. You will also be expected to attend me at meals, to accompany me on certain occasions, Moray continued, his gaze unwavering. You will be a presence in this household, a reminder to my men, and to any potential enemies, that I am not entirely alone. Beatrice felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She understood the implication. She would be a hostage, of sorts, a guarantee of her good behavior, and a deterrent against any treachery from her brother or Ashworth. I understand, she said, her voice steady. I will abide by your terms. Moray gave a curt nod. Good. Then it is settled. You will be given a chamber in the west wing. Hamish will show you the way. He turned to the red-haired man, who stepped forward with a respectful bow. See that Lady Beatrice is provided with food and warm clothing, Moray instructed, and ensure that her mare is well cared for. Hamish nodded and gestured for Beatrice to follow him. She rose from the chair, her legs stiff from the long ride. As she passed Moray, she paused, meeting his gaze one last time. Thank you, Sir Geoffrey, she said, her voice sincere. For your protection. For your trust. He didn't reply, merely inclined his head slightly. But as Beatrice followed Hamish out of the hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just entered into a bargain far more complex and far more dangerous than she had initially realized. The firelight had cast long shadows, and she had the distinct impression she had only seen the surface of the Winter Lord's decree, with more to be unveiled in the cold, harsh light of the days to come. Chapter 4. Ghosts of Alden. The west wing of Moray was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and low-ceiling chambers, a stark contrast to the spacious, airy rooms of Blackmere. The stone walls were cold and damp, and the only light came from flickering torches placed at infrequent intervals. The air was thick with a scent of mildew and old stone, a smell that spoke of centuries of history, of lives lived and lost within these walls. Hamish, despite his gruff exterior, proved to be a surprisingly gentle guide. He led her through the maze of passageways with a quiet efficiency, his hand hovering protectively near the hilt of his sword, as if anticipating danger around every corner. He explained in a few terse sentences that the West Wing was mostly unused, reserved for guests or prisoners, depending on the circumstances. The chamber he showed her was small and sparsely furnished, containing a narrow bed, a wooden chest, a small table, and a stool. A single window, covered with oiled parchment, offered a dim view of the snow-covered courtyard. A fire had been laid in the small hearth, but it had not yet been lit. "It's not much, my lady," Hamish said, his voice apologetic.
But it's clean and dry.
"And it's safe." "It is more than enough," Beatrice replied, trying to sound grateful. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, and the prospect of a bed, however humble, was immensely appealing. Hamish nodded, then produced a small key from his belt. "This locks from the inside, my lady. For your protection." He handed her the key, his eyes meeting hers with a look of genuine concern. "There are stories about this wing, about ghosts. But don't let them frighten you. They're just stories." Beatrice accepted the key, her fingers brushing against his. She managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Hamish. I am not easily frightened." He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then simply bowed and left, closing the door behind him. Beatrice heard the click of the lock, a sound that was both reassuring and isolating. She stood for a moment, listening to the silence. The wind howled outside, rattling the parchment in the window, and she could hear the faint creak of the old building settling around her. "The ghosts of Moray," Hamish had said. She shivered, despite herself. She moved to the hearth and knelt down, taking the flint and tinder that had been left there. Her fingers were numb with cold, and it took several attempts before she managed to coax a spark into flame. The fire slowly caught, casting a flickering glow around the small chamber, chasing away some of the gloom. As the warmth began to spread, Beatrice's thoughts turned to Sir Geoffrey de Moray, the Winter Lord. He was an enigma, a man of contradictions. He had offered her sanctuary, yet he had made it clear that she was his prisoner, in a sense. He was harsh and unyielding, yet she had sensed a flicker of something else beneath his icy exterior, a sadness, perhaps, or a deep-seated weariness. She remembered the stories Elspeth had told her, tales of Moray's bravery in battle, his unwavering loyalty to his clan, his tragic loss of his wife and child in a raid by a rival clan, years ago, at a place named in hushed whispers as Alden. The Battle of Alden was legendary in these lands, a bloody conflict that had left scars not just on the landscape, but on the hearts of those who had survived it. Beatrice wondered if the ghosts of Alden haunted Moray still, if they were the source of his coldness, his isolation. She had seen the way he looked at her, the suspicion in his eyes, the wariness. He was a man who had been deeply wounded, a man who had learned to trust no one. She unpacked the small bundle of belongings she had managed to bring with her, laying them out on the wooden chest. A few changes of clothes, a brush and comb, a small prayer book, a silver locket, a different locket, as she'd traded her mother's. This one held only a few strands of faded baby's hair, from a sister who had not survived her first winter, another ghost in Beatrice's own past. She changed into a warmer gown, a simple woolen dress in a deep shade of blue. Then, she sat on the stool by the fire, staring into the flames. Her thoughts drifted back to Blackmere, to her brother, to Ashworth. They would be searching for her, she knew. Edmund's pride would be wounded, and Ashworth's greed would be thwarted. They would not give up easily. She wondered if Moray could protect her from them. He was a formidable warrior, she had no doubt, but he was also a lone wolf, ruling over a sparsely populated land. Could he withstand the combined might of Blackmere and Ashworth? The fire began to die down, the embers glowing red in the darkness. Beatrice rose and added more wood, watching as the flames leaped up again, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, despite her fears and uncertainties. She was safe, for now, sheltered within these ancient walls. She climbed into the narrow bed, pulling the rough woolen blankets around her. The mattress was hard, the pillows lumpy, but she was too tired to care. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind howling outside. As she drifted off to sleep, she saw him again, in her mind's eye. The Winter Lord, standing in the snow-filled courtyard, his face obscured by shadows, his eyes gleaming with an unnerving intensity. She wondered what secrets he hid, what demons he battled. And she wondered what role she would play in his lonely, frozen world. The last thought that whispered across her tired mind, before sleep took her, was a curious sense of inevitability, that the wind and snow had woven her path to his door for reasons she could not yet fully understand. It felt like the beginning of a story, not the end. Chapter 5. The Price of Protection. The morning light, filtered through the oiled parchment of the window, was pale and weak. Beatrice awoke to the sound of a gentle rapping on her door. She sat up, her body stiff and sore from the previous day's journey. "My lady?" It was Hamish's voice, muffled by the thick wood. "Are you awake?" "Yes," Beatrice called out, pushing back the blankets.
"Come in."
The door opened, and Hamish entered, carrying a tray laden with food. The aroma of warm bread, porridge, and something savory roasted meat perhaps filled the small chamber, making Beatrice's stomach rumble. "Sir Geoffrey has requested your presence at breakfast," Hamish said, placing the tray on the table. "He wishes to discuss your duties." Beatrice nodded, her apprehension returning. She had known this moment would come, the moment when the Winter Lord would define the price of her protection. "I will be ready shortly," she said. Hamish bowed and left, closing the door behind him. Beatrice washed her face with cold water from a basin that had been left on the chest, then dressed quickly in the same blue woolen gown she had worn the previous night. She brushed her hair, braiding it neatly, and then sat down to eat. The food was simple, but surprisingly good. The porridge was thick and creamy, sweetened with honey, and the roasted meat was tender and flavorful. Beatrice ate with a hearty appetite, realizing how hungry she was after her ordeal. As she ate, she studied the chamber more closely. It was plain, almost austere, but it had a certain charm. The stone walls were thick and solid, offering a sense of security, and the fire, which Hamish had rekindled, cast a warm glow over the room. It was a far cry from the opulent chambers of Blackmere, but it felt safe. She finished her breakfast and rose, smoothing down her gown. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for her meeting with Moray. She had to show him that she was strong, resilient, and worthy of his protection. She would not be a burden, a helpless damsel in distress. She found Moray in the great hall, seated at the head of a long wooden table. Several of his men were also present, seated along the sides of the table, their faces watchful. The hall was much as she remembered it from the previous night, dimly lit, with a large fire blazing in the hearth. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and roasted meat. Moray looked up as she approached, his icy gaze sweeping over her. He was dressed in dark, practical clothing, a leather jerkin, woolen breeches, and sturdy boots. He looked every inch the warrior, the lord of this harsh, unforgiving land. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You have slept well, I trust?" "Yes, thank you, Sir Geoffrey," Beatrice replied, meeting his gaze. She refused to be intimidated by his presence, by the scrutiny of his men. He gestured towards a chair opposite him, at the far end of the table.
"Sit."
"We have much to discuss." Beatrice obeyed, taking her seat. She noticed that the table was laid with a simple but substantial meal: bread, cheese, cold meats, and a pitcher of ale. The men around the table were eating with gusto, their conversations muted. Moray took a sip of ale from a large pewter mug, then set it down, his gaze fixed on Beatrice. "As I told you last night, you are here as my ward." That means you are under my protection, but it also means you are subject to my rules. Beatrice nodded, her heart pounding. I understand. Your primary duty will be to assist in the running of this household, Moray continued. You will work alongside my servants, learning their tasks and contributing your own skills. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. I understand you are proficient in needlework. We have need of someone to mend our clothing, our banners, and to create new garments when necessary. Can you do this? Yes, Sir Geoffrey, Beatrice replied. I am skilled in all manner of needlework. She had spent countless hours at Blackmere, stitching tapestries, embroidering gowns, and mending linens. It was a skill she had both resented and found solace in.
Good, Moray said.
You will also assist in the kitchens, helping to prepare meals, and in the still room, preserving food and brewing medicines. Are you familiar with these tasks? Beatrice nodded again. I have some knowledge of them, though I have not had much practical experience. She had often watched the servants at Blackmere performing these duties, but she had rarely been allowed to participate. You will learn, Moray said, his voice firm. We work hard here, Lady Beatrice. We do not tolerate idleness or incompetence. I am not afraid of hard work, Sir Geoffrey, Beatrice said, her voice gaining strength. I am willing to learn, and I will do my best to be of service. He studied her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. Then he gave a curt nod. Very well. You will begin your duties today. Alara, my housekeeper, will instruct you. He gestured towards a woman seated further down the table, a middle-aged woman with a kind face and a no-nonsense demeanor. Alara nodded to Beatrice, her expression welcoming. There is one more matter, Moray continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. As I mentioned last night, you will also be expected to attend me at certain times. You will be a presence in this household, a symbol of my authority, and a deterrent to any who might wish me harm. Beatrice felt a flush rise to her cheeks again. She knew what he meant. She would be a hostage, a living guarantee of her good behavior, and a warning to her brother and Ashworth. I understand, Sir Geoffrey, she said, her voice steady. I will do as you ask. He nodded, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment longer than necessary. Beatrice felt a strange flutter in her chest, a mixture of apprehension and something else. Something she couldn't quite define. The meeting ended, and Beatrice was dismissed. She rose from the chair, her legs feeling a little unsteady. As she walked away, she could feel Moray's eyes on her back, a constant reminder of her precarious position. She was his ward, his prisoner, his possession. But she was also safe, for now, from the clutches of her brother and the unwanted attentions of Lord Ashworth. And that, she realized, was a price she was willing to pay. As she walked toward the kitchens, guided by Alara, Beatrice took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. This was her new life, and she would face it with courage and determination. She was a falcon, after all, and even a caged falcon could still dream of flight. Chapter 6. A bargain struck in shadow. The kitchens of Moray were a world away from the quiet, almost sterile efficiency of Blackmere's. Here, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasting meat, and a dozen different spices. The room was large and chaotic, with a massive hearth dominating one wall, and several smaller ovens and cooking fires scattered throughout. Servants bustled about, chopping vegetables, stirring pots, and shouting orders to one another. Alara, the housekeeper, proved to be a surprisingly warm and welcoming presence amidst the chaos. She greeted Beatrice with a kind smile and a firm handshake, her eyes assessing but not unkind. Welcome to the kitchens, Lady Beatrice, she said, her voice carrying easily over the din. I understand you have some experience in this area? Some, Beatrice admitted, though I have mostly observed rather than participated. Alara nodded, her expression understanding. Well, you'll be participating here, my lady. We all work hard in Moray. No one sits idle. She led Beatrice to a large wooden table, where several other women were already at work, chopping vegetables and preparing dough. Alara introduced them briefly. Morag, a stout, cheerful woman with flour dusting her apron, Isabel, a younger girl with quick hands and a shy smile, and Ailsa, a stern-faced woman with a sharp tongue who seemed to regard Beatrice with suspicion. "You'll start by helping with the vegetables," Alara instructed, handing Beatrice a knife and a basket of root vegetables. "We're making a stew for the evening meal. It needs to be hearty and filling, especially in this weather." Beatrice took the knife, her fingers feeling clumsy at first. She had often watched the servants at Blackmere performing this task, but she had never done it herself for any extended period. The vegetables were rough and earthy, their skins thick and stubborn. She began to peel and chop, trying to mimic the quick, efficient movements of the other women. Her hands were slow at first, and she nicked her finger more than once, drawing a hiss of pain. Ailsa, who was working next to her, glanced over with a smirk. "Not used to honest labor, are you, my lady?" she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. Beatrice flushed, but she kept her head down, focusing on her task. "I am learning," she said, her voice steady. Morag, the stout woman, intervened, her voice gentle. "Don't mind Ailsa, my lady. She's got a sharp tongue, but a good heart." Beatrice managed a weak smile. She continued to work, her hands gradually becoming more accustomed to the task. The rhythm of chopping, the shared effort of preparing the meal, began to have a calming effect on her. She was surrounded by the warmth of the fire, the comforting aromas of the food, and the camaraderie of the other women. As the day wore on, Beatrice began to feel a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose that she had not experienced in a long time. She was no longer a pampered noblewoman, isolated in her gilded cage. She was a worker, a contributor, a part of something larger than herself. Alara, she discovered, was a skilled and knowledgeable cook and a patient teacher. She showed Beatrice how to knead dough, how to judge the heat of the ovens, how to blend spices to create flavorful dishes. She also shared stories of life at Moray, of the hardships and the joys, of the loyalty and the resilience of its people. "We're a close-knit community here, my lady," Alara said, as they stirred a large pot of simmering stew. "We rely on each other, especially in these harsh times. And we're loyal to Sir Geoffrey. He's a hard man, but a just one. He cares for his people." Beatrice listened intently, absorbing Alara's words. She was beginning to understand the dynamics of this place, the bonds that held it together. She was also beginning to see a different side of the Winter Lord, a side that was not visible in the Great Hall or in his formal pronouncements. In the late afternoon, as the light began to fade, Moray himself entered the kitchens. He was accompanied by Gareth, the lean, dark-haired man who had been present at her arrival. The kitchen staff fell silent, their eyes turning towards their lord. Moray's gaze swept over the room, taking in the scene. He paused when he saw Beatrice, her hands covered in flour, her face flushed from the heat of the fire. He approached her, his expression unreadable. "How is our ward progressing, Alara?" he asked, his voice low. Alara smiled, her eyes twinkling. "She's a quick learner, Sir Geoffrey, and she's not afraid of hard work." Moray nodded, his gaze lingering on Beatrice for a moment longer. "Good. We need all hands on deck." He turned to Gareth. "We ride out at dawn. There have been reports of wolves preying on livestock in the northern pastures. We need to assess the situation." Gareth nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "I'll see to the preparations, my lord." Moray turned back to Beatrice, his icy gaze piercing. "You will remain here, under Alara's supervision. You are not to leave the castle walls without my express permission." Beatrice met his gaze, her chin lifted. "I understand, Sir Geoffrey." He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then simply gave a curt nod and left, Gareth following close behind. As soon as they were gone, the kitchen erupted in a flurry of whispered conversations. Beatrice felt a surge of unease. Wolves? The northern pastures were close to the border with Blackmere lands. Was this just a routine patrol, or was there something more going on? Alara placed a comforting hand on her arm. "Don't worry, my lady," she said. "Sir Geoffrey can handle a few wolves. He's faced far worse." Beatrice nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The way Moray had looked at her, The way he had emphasized her confinement to the castle, it felt like a warning, a subtle acknowledgement of a danger she couldn't yet comprehend. As shadows lengthened and the evening meal preparations continued, she knew that the bargain she'd struck with the Winter Lord had just become a little more complicated and a lot more shrouded in the uncertainties of his world. The sense of a coming storm, both literal and figurative, settled over her, heavy as the smoke-filled air. Chapter 7. Whispers of Blackmere. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Beatrice immersed herself in the work of the household, finding a strange solace in the rhythm of daily tasks. She learned to knead dough with Morag, to brew medicinal herbs with Alara, and even to tolerate Ailsa's sharp tongue. She mended clothes and linens, her needle flying across the fabric, creating order out of frayed edges and worn seams. She found that the physical labor, the focus on tangible tasks, helped to quiet the anxieties that still churned within her. She was safe, for now, within the walls of Moray, but she knew that her brother would not give up easily. The thought of Ashworth, of his cold eyes and cruel hands, still sent shivers down her spine.
She saw little of Moray.
He was often out riding, patrolling the lands, or closeted with his men in the Great Hall, discussing matters of strategy and defense. When she did see him, he was distant and formal, his gaze unreadable. He treated her with a cool courtesy, but there was always a barrier between them, a sense of unspoken tension. She learned more about him from the other servants, from the whispered conversations she overheard in the kitchens and the corridors. They spoke of his bravery, his unwavering loyalty to his clan, his fierce determination to protect his people. They also spoke of his loneliness, his isolation, the ghosts of Alden that still haunted him. "He hasn't been the same since the battle," Alara said one evening, as they sat by the fire in the housekeeper's small chamber, mending a torn tapestry. "He lost his wife, his child, everything. He built these walls around himself, around his heart." Beatrice nodded, her fingers pausing in their work. She remembered the flicker of sadness she had seen in his eyes, the weariness that seemed to weigh him down. She wondered if he would ever find peace, if he would ever allow himself to feel again. One afternoon, while Beatrice was working in the still room, sorting herbs and berries, Hamish entered, his face grim. "My lady," he said, his voice low. "Sir Geoffrey wishes to see you." "In the library?" Beatrice felt a jolt of apprehension. The library? That was unusual. Moray rarely summoned her there. It was his private sanctuary, a place where he kept his books, his maps, his secrets. She followed Hamish through the winding corridors, her heart pounding. The library was a small, circular chamber, located in one of the towers of the keep. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with leather-bound books and ancient scrolls. A single window, overlooking the snow-covered landscape, provided the only light. Moray was standing by the window, his back to the door, his hands clasped behind him. He turned as she entered, his face shadowed. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice formal. "I have received news." "From Blackmere." Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. "What news?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Your brother, Lord Edmund, has sent a messenger," Moray said. "He demands your return. He claims you are his ward, his property, and that I am holding you against your will." Beatrice took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. "That is a lie," she said, her voice steady. "I came here of my own free will. I am fleeing a forced marriage." "I know that," Moray said, his gaze unwavering. "But Edmund does not. And he has offered a substantial reward for your safe return." Beatrice felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. "What are you going to do?" Moray was silent for a long moment, his eyes studying her face. "I have given Edmund my answer," he said finally. "I have told him that you are under my protection, and that you will remain here, at Moray, for as long as you wish." Relief flooded through Beatrice, so intense that she felt weak. "Thank you, Sir Geoffrey," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you." He gave a curt nod. "But this is not the end of it, Lady Beatrice. Your brother is a stubborn man, and Ashworth he is not one to be trifled with. They will not give up easily. What can they do?" Beatrice asked. You have defied them. You have offered me sanctuary. They can make trouble, Moray said, his voice grim. They can raid our lands, attack our people, try to force my hand. Beatrice felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had brought this danger upon Moray, upon his people. She had sought refuge here, but she had also brought the threat of war. He must have sensed her distress, because for the briefest of moments his facial expression softened. Do not blame yourself, my lady. You did what you had to, seeking your survival. He paced to the window, his gaze returning to the bleak landscape, then faced her again. I must know, Lady Beatrice, is there anyone at Blackmere who can attest to your unwillingness? To the truth of your flight? Someone Edmund might heed, however grudgingly? The question hung heavy in the air, a sudden challenge laid upon the fragile foundation of her sanctuary. She felt trapped between her gratitude and the escalating stakes of her presence there, a presence that had become a whispered threat in the wind, blowing all the way from Blackmere. Chapter 8. The Serpent's Kiss. Beatrice racked her brain, searching for a name, a flicker of hope in the oppressive darkness of Blackmere. Her brother, Edmund, was a law unto himself, swayed only by power and greed. The household staff were either too terrified or too complicit to speak against him. Ashworth, the thought of him, made her shudder. Then, a name surfaced, a faint whisper from the past. There is Father Michael, she said, her voice hesitant. He was the chaplain at Blackmere for many years. He christened me. He knows me well. Moray raised an eyebrow, his gaze questioning. And would he speak for you? Against your brother? He is a man of God, Beatrice said. He values truth and justice. But he is also old and frail. Edmund has little patience for him. She remembered Father Michael's gentle smile, his kind eyes, the way he had always treated her with respect, even when her brother had dismissed her as a useless girl. But she also remembered the fear she had seen in his eyes, the way he had shrunk from Edmund's wrath. We must try, Moray said, his voice firm. I will send a message to Father Michael, under my seal. I will ask him to intercede on your behalf, to confirm your unwillingness to wed Ashworth. He paused, his gaze searching her face. But we must also be prepared for the worst. Edmund may ignore his plea, or even silence him. Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. The thought of Father Michael, old and vulnerable, facing her brother's wrath, filled her with dread. I will not let that happen, she said, her voice rising. I will not let him harm anyone else on my account. You have no choice, Lady Beatrice, Moray said, his voice cold. You are under my protection, and I will make the decisions. You will abide by my commands. His words were a harsh reminder of her precarious position. She was a guest, a ward, a prisoner, whatever he chose to call her. She had no power, no control over her own fate. He turned away from her, his gaze fixed on the window, his silhouette framed against the pale winter light. Beatrice felt a surge of frustration, of helplessness. She wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of her situation, but she knew it would be futile. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She had to be strong, resilient. She had to trust Moray, even if she didn't understand him, even if she feared him. What will you do? She asked, her voice softer now. I will prepare for war, Moray said, his voice grim. I will strengthen our defenses, call upon my allies, and be ready to repel any attack. He turned back to her, his icy gaze piercing. And you, Lady Beatrice, will remain here, out of sight. You will not endanger yourself or my men by any foolish actions. His words were a command, a warning. Beatrice met his gaze, her chin lifted. I understand, she said. I will obey. But even as she spoke the words, a seed of rebellion began to sprout in her heart. She would not be a passive pawn in this game. She would find a way to help, to protect herself, to fight for her freedom. As she left the library, she noticed a small, almost hidden door tucked away behind a tapestry. It was slightly ajar, and she could hear faint voices coming from within. Curiosity overcoming her, she paused, listening. It was Moray's voice, low and urgent, speaking to someone she couldn't see. Must be discreet. If Edmund discovers our plan, It will be disastrous. Another voice, deeper and rougher, responded. We will be careful, my lord. But the risk is great. The risk is worth taking, Moray said. We must protect her. She is more important than you know. Beatrice's heart skipped a beat. What plan? What risk? And why was she so important? She wanted to push the door open further, to demand answers, but she knew it would be foolish. She had to be patient, to bide her time, to uncover the truth gradually. She retreated from the door, her mind racing. Moray was hiding something significant. He was playing a dangerous game, and she was caught in the middle of it. As she walked back to the kitchens, she felt a new sense of unease, a sense of being watched, of being manipulated. The whispers of Blackmere had reached Moray, but now there were new whispers, secrets swirling within these ancient walls, secrets that could determine her fate. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the serpent's kiss of betrayal was far closer than she had ever imagined. The feeling of being a pawn, even in supposed sanctuary, deepened, leaving her isolated and questioning everything. Chapter 9. Beneath a Frozen Moon. The following days were filled with a tense, almost suffocating anticipation. Moray had doubled the guard, and the castle was abuzz with preparations for a potential attack. Men sharpened swords, repaired armor, and practiced their drills in the courtyard. The air was thick with a scent of steel, leather, and fear. Beatrice continued her duties in the kitchens and the stillroom, but her heart was not in it. She found it difficult to concentrate, her mind constantly replaying the overheard conversation in the library. What plan was Moray hatching? And why was she so important to him? She tried to glean information from the other servants, but they were tight-lipped, either unwilling or unable to reveal anything of substance. Alara, usually so forthcoming, seemed unusually reserved, her answers evasive. Even Hamish, who had always been kind to her, seemed to avoid her gaze. Beatrice felt increasingly isolated, trapped within the walls of Moray, surrounded by secrets and uncertainties. She longed to escape, to run, to find a place where she could be free, but she knew it was impossible. She was under Moray's protection, and she had to trust him, even if she didn't understand his motives. One evening, after a long day of work, Beatrice found herself drawn to the battlements. The sky was clear, and a full moon, cold and bright, cast a silvery glow over the snow-covered landscape. The wind was still, and the silence was almost deafening. She stood at the edge of the wall, looking out at the vast expanse of frozen wilderness. The world seemed to stretch on forever, a desolate, beautiful, unforgiving landscape. She felt a strange sense of peace, a sense of connection to something larger than herself. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard a sound behind her. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Moray, standing in the shadows, his face obscured by the darkness. Lady Beatrice, he said, his voice low. What are you doing here? I couldn't sleep, Beatrice said, her voice trembling slightly. I needed some air. He stepped closer, his tall figure looming over her. The moonlight illuminated his face, revealing the harsh lines of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze. He looked tired, she noticed, his eyes shadowed with weariness. It is dangerous to be out here alone, he said, his voice a low rumble. You should be inside. I am not afraid, Beatrice said, her voice gaining strength. I have faced worse dangers than this. He studied her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. Then he gave a slight nod. You are brave, I will give you that. He turned and looked out at the landscape, his gaze following the line of the distant hills. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the faint whisper of the wind. Do you ever regret it? Beatrice asked, her voice barely a whisper. Coming back here? To this lonely place? He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, his voice low and filled with a deep sadness, every day. Beatrice felt a pang of sympathy for him. She understood his loneliness, his isolation. She, too, had known the pain of loss, the emptiness of a life devoid of love and companionship. Why did you come back? she asked, her voice gentle. Duty, he said, his voice flat. Loyalty. To my clan, to my people. To the memory of those I lost. He turned to her, his gaze searching her face. And you, Lady Beatrice? Do you regret coming here? No, Beatrice said, her voice firm. I am grateful for your protection. Even if it is a gilded cage. He raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. A gilded cage? Is that how you see it? It is a cage nonetheless, Beatrice said. I am not free to leave, to make my own choices. You are free to make choices within the confines of this cage, Moray said. You are free to choose how you will live your life, how you will contribute to this household, how you will face the challenges that lie ahead. He paused, his gaze intense. And you are free to choose whether or not to trust me. Beatrice felt a shiver run down her spine. His words were a challenge, an invitation. She knew that he was testing her, pushing her, trying to understand her. She met his gaze, her chin lifted. I do not trust easily, Sir Geoffrey, she said. But I am willing to consider it. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or even respect, crossed his face. He held her gaze for a long moment, the moonlight illuminating the depths of his icy blue eyes. Then, he turned with a rustle of his dark cloak and said quietly, we should return inside. It grows late. As they walked back towards the keep, side by side but not touching, she realized that something had shifted between them. The conversation had not revealed his secrets, but it had revealed a sliver of his soul. Beneath the frozen exterior, the Winter Lord was a man capable of feeling, of regretting, of yearning for something more. And, for the first time since arriving at Moray, Beatrice felt a glimmer of hope, not just for her own survival, but for the possibility of a connection, a fragile, tentative bond forged beneath a frozen moon. It was a dangerous hope, she knew, but it was hope nonetheless. Chapter 10. Trials of Trust. The message sent to Father Michael at Blackmere remained unanswered, a silence that hung heavy with unspoken threat. Moray, while outwardly calm, intensified the preparations for a possible attack. He drilled his men relentlessly, stockpiled supplies, and sent scouts to patrol the borders of his land. The tension within the castle walls was palpable, a constant hum of anxiety that frayed nerves and shortened tempers. Beatrice found herself increasingly drawn to Moray, despite her reservations, despite the knowledge that he was her captor, in a sense. She observed him closely, watching the way he interacted with his men, the way he commanded respect and loyalty without resorting to cruelty or fear. She saw the burden of responsibility he carried, the weight of his past, the loneliness that seemed to emanate from him like the cold of a winter's night. She began to seek him out, finding excuses to be near him, to engage him in conversation. She would ask him about the history of Moray, about the legends of the land, about the challenges of ruling a clan in such a harsh environment. He answered her questions patiently, sometimes even with a hint of amusement, his icy facade thawing slightly in her presence. One afternoon, she found him in the stables, tending to his warhorse, a magnificent black stallion named Shadow. The horse was restless, its ears twitching, its nostrils flaring. Moray was speaking to it in a low, soothing voice, his hand stroking its neck. He senses the tension, Beatrice said, approaching him cautiously. Animals are sensitive to such things. Moray turned, his expression guarded. They are, he agreed. And so are you, it seems. Beatrice met his gaze, her chin lifted. I am not afraid, Sir Geoffrey. I have lived with tension and fear all my life. He studied her for a moment, his eyes searching her face. You are stronger than you appear, Lady Beatrice. I have had to be, she replied. Women in my position are often underestimated. We are seen as weak, fragile, easily manipulated. But we're not. A flicker of respect crossed his face. I am beginning to see that. He turned back to his horse, his hand continuing to stroke its neck. Beatrice watched him, admiring the way he moved, the strength and grace of his body. She was drawn to his power, his confidence, his unwavering sense of purpose. What will you do if my brother attacks? She asked, her voice low. I will defend my lands, my people, Moray said, his voice grim. I will fight to the death, if necessary.
And what about me? Beatrice asked. Will you send me back to him, to save yourself?
He turned to her, his icy gaze piercing. I made you a promise, Lady Beatrice. I will protect you. I do not break my oaths. His words sent a shiver of warmth through her, a feeling she had not expected. She realized that she was beginning to trust him, despite her better judgment, despite the dangers that surrounded them.
But why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why are you doing this? You owe me nothing. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distance. Then, he said, his voice low and filled with a strange intensity, perhaps I see something in you, Lady Beatrice. Something worth protecting. He didn't elaborate, and Beatrice didn't press him. She knew that he was a man of secrets, a man who kept his emotions tightly guarded. But she had seen a glimpse of something deeper, something that hinted at a vulnerability, a hidden pain. As the days turned into weeks, the unspoken bond between them grew stronger. They shared meals together, sometimes in the great hall with his men, sometimes alone in the library, surrounded by his books and maps. They talked about their lives, their hopes, their fears. They challenged each other, argued, debated. They learned to respect each other's strengths, to understand each other's weaknesses. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the library, Moray showed her a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was old, its surface worn smooth by time. This belonged to my wife, he said, his voice husky. She was a skilled healer like you. She used this to store her herbs and medicines. He opened the box, revealing a collection of dried leaves, roots, and berries, each carefully labeled in a delicate, faded script. Beatrice recognized some of them chamomile, lavender, valerian, but others were unfamiliar to her. She taught me much about the healing arts, Moray said. She had a gift, a connection to the natural world. He closed the box, his fingers lingering on the smooth wood. Beatrice saw the pain in his eyes, the grief that he still carried. She reached out and placed her hand on his, a gesture of comfort, of understanding. He looked at her, his gaze intense. For a moment, the ice melted, and she saw the raw, vulnerable man beneath the Winter Lord's facade. He didn't pull away, didn't reject her touch. He simply held her gaze, and in that moment, something shifted between them, a silent acknowledgement of a shared pain, a shared humanity. It was a moment of profound connection, a trial of trust passed, not with words, but with a simple, human touch that spoke volumes in the silence of the ancient library. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, leaving Beatrice breathless and wondering where this newfound intimacy would lead. Chapter 11. The Unveiling of Lies. The fragile peace shattered with the arrival of a raven, bearing a message sealed not with Edmund's crest, but with a simple, almost crude, wax impression of a cross. Moray read the parchment, his face growing grimmer with each line. He handed it to Beatrice, his expression unreadable. The message was brief, written in a shaky hand, barely legible. My Lord Moray, Lady Beatrice speaks true. Forced marriage. Ashworth cruel. Edmund blinded by greed. I fear for her life. My days are numbered. God's will be done. Father Michael. Beatrice felt a wave of relief, followed by a surge of fear. Father Michael had spoken for her, risked his life to tell the truth. But the message also hinted at a dire situation, at the danger he was in. He confirms your story, Moray said, his voice flat. But he also confirms our fears. Your brother will not listen to reason. We have to help him, Beatrice said, her voice rising. Father Michael, he is a good man. He doesn't deserve to suffer for my sake. I know, Moray said, his gaze unwavering. But we cannot simply ride into Blackmere and demand his release. That would be suicide. Then what can we do? Beatrice asked, her voice desperate. Moray was silent for a long moment, his mind clearly racing. There may be another way, he said finally, a more discreet approach. He explained his plan, the one he had hinted at in the library, the one he had discussed with Gareth in hushed tones. It was a dangerous plan, risky, almost foolhardy. But it was their only hope. He planned to send a small group of men, led by Gareth, to infiltrate Blackmere disguised as traveling merchants. They would seek out Father Michael, assess his situation, and, if possible, smuggle him out of the castle. It is a long shot, Moray admitted, but it is worth the risk. We cannot abandon him. Beatrice felt a surge of admiration for him, for his willingness to risk his men's lives, for his unwavering commitment to justice. She also felt a profound sense of guilt. This was all her fault. She had brought this danger upon Moray, upon his people, upon Father Michael. "I want to go with them," she said, her voice firm. Moray looked at her, his eyes widening in surprise. "Absolutely not," he said. "It is far too dangerous. You will remain here, where you are safe." "I am not safe," Beatrice argued. "Not while Father Michael is in danger. I know Blackmere. I know its secrets, its hidden passages. I can help." "You are a liability," Moray said, his voice harsh. "You would slow them down, endanger them. You are not a warrior." "I may not be a warrior," Beatrice said, her voice rising. "But I am not helpless. I am resourceful. I am quick-witted, and I am determined. I will not stand idly by while others risk their lives for me." They argued, their voices rising in the tense silence of the library. Beatrice pleaded, begged, demanded. Moray refused, resisted, commanded. Finally, he relented, his resistance crumbling under the weight of her determination. "Very well," he said, his voice grudging. "You may go. But you will obey Gareth's orders implicitly. You will not take any unnecessary risks. And you will not jeopardize the mission." Beatrice felt a surge of relief, mixed with a healthy dose of fear. She knew that she was stepping into a dangerous situation, that she might be walking into a trap. But she also knew that she had to do this for Father Michael, for herself, for the chance to finally take control of her own fate. The preparations were made quickly, discreetly. Beatrice exchanged her gown for a simple tunic and breeches, borrowed from one of the younger stable boys. She bound her hair tightly, concealing it beneath a woolen cap. She looked like a boy, a scrawny, unremarkable youth. Gareth, who had initially protested her inclusion, seemed to grudgingly accept her presence. He gave her a curt nod, his eyes assessing her disguise. "You look passable," he said. "But stay close to me, and do as I say." "No heroics." They set out at dusk, a small group of 5, riding under the cover of darkness. The journey was long and arduous, the terrain rough and unforgiving. Beatrice, despite her initial enthusiasm, found herself struggling to keep up. She was not used to riding astride, and her muscles ached with the unfamiliar effort. As they approached Blackmere, Beatrice felt a growing sense of dread. The castle loomed before them, a dark, ominous silhouette against the night sky. It was her former home, her prison, the place where she had known both comfort and despair. They entered the castle through a secret passage, a narrow, winding tunnel that Beatrice had discovered as a child. It led to a disused storeroom, hidden behind a tapestry in the kitchens. The air was damp and musty, the silence broken only by the scuttling of rats. Gareth led the way, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Beatrice followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. They moved through the darkened corridors, their footsteps echoing eerily. They found Father Michael, with relative ease, which felt unsettling. He was in his small chamber. He was alone. The old priest was frail and weak, his face pale and drawn. He looked at Beatrice with a mixture of surprise and relief. "Beatrice?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Is it really you?" "Yes, Father," Beatrice said, kneeling beside him. "We have come to rescue you." "God be praised," Father Michael said, his eyes filling with tears. "But it is too dangerous. Edmund, he will kill you all." "We will be careful, Father," Gareth said, his voice reassuring. "We have a plan." As they prepared to leave, Father Michael stopped them. He handed Beatrice a piece of parchment. "This belongs to you. Edmund ordered me to burn it, but I hid it instead." Beatrice unfolded the parchment, her hands shaking. It was a letter, written in her mother's elegant script, dated shortly before her death. The letter revealed a shocking truth, a secret that had been hidden from her for all these years. Her mother had not died of a fever, as she had always been told. She had been poisoned by Edmund, who had coveted her inheritance, her power, her influence. Beatrice felt a wave of nausea, of disbelief, of overwhelming grief. Her own brother, the man she had feared, the man she had fled, he was a murderer. He had killed their mother, the one person who had truly loved her. The unveiling of this lie, the serpent's kiss of betrayal revealed in her mother's own words, left her reeling, the world she thought she knew crumbling around her. The escape, Father Michael. Everything faded into the background as this devastating truth consumed her. Chapter 12. A Knight's Scarred Heart. The escape from Blackmere was a blur. Beatrice, numb with shock and grief, moved like an automaton, following Gareth's instructions without question. They managed to smuggle Father Michael out of the castle, undetected, and began the long journey back to Moray. The weight of her mother's letter, clutched tightly in her hand, was a physical manifestation of the burden she now carried. Edmund's betrayal was a wound that cut deeper than any she had ever known. It was not just the loss of her mother, but the loss of her past, her family, her entire sense of identity. They arrived back at Moray under the cover of a pre-dawn mist, exhausted and emotionally drained. Moray was waiting for them in the courtyard, his face etched with concern. He took one look at Beatrice's pale, drawn face and knew that something was terribly wrong. What happened? He asked, his voice urgent. Is Father Michael safe? He is safe, Gareth replied. But there have been developments. Moray led them to the library, his private sanctuary, where a fire blazed in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. He listened in silence as Gareth recounted the events of the escape, and as Beatrice, her voice trembling, revealed the contents of her mother's letter. When she finished, the room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Moray's expression was unreadable, his icy gaze fixed on the distance. Beatrice felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had expected what? Sympathy? Anger? She didn't know. But she had not expected this cold, impassive silence. I am sorry, Lady Beatrice, he said finally, his voice flat. For your loss. For the betrayal you have suffered. His words were formal, distant, offering little comfort. Beatrice felt a knot of disappointment tighten in her chest. She had hoped for more, for a connection, for a shared understanding of the pain she was feeling. What will you do now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I will continue to protect you, Moray said, his gaze unwavering. That is my duty, my oath. But what about Edmund? Beatrice asked. He is a murderer. He must be brought to justice. Justice is a complex matter, Lady Beatrice, Moray said, especially in these times. Your brother is a powerful lord, with allies and influence. We cannot simply accuse him of murder without proof, without witnesses. But the letter, Beatrice protested. A letter from a dead woman? Moray said, his voice sharp. It is not enough. It could be dismissed as a forgery, a fabrication. Beatrice felt a surge of frustration, of helplessness. She wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all, but she knew it would be futile. There must be something we can do, she said, her voice pleading. Moray was silent for a long moment, his mind clearly racing. There may be one way, he said finally, but it is a dangerous path, one that could lead to war. He explained his plan, a plan that involved seeking the support of other Highland lords, of those who had grown weary of Edmund's tyranny and Ashworth's cruelty. It was a long shot, a gamble, but it was their only hope of bringing Edmund to justice. It will take time, Moray said, and it will require persuasion. Not all lords are willing to risk their necks for the sake of justice. I will help, Beatrice said, her voice firm. I will speak to them. I will tell them my story. I will convince them. Moray looked at her, his eyes searching her face. He saw the determination in her eyes, the fire that burned within her, despite her grief and despair. He saw the strength that she had hidden beneath her gentle exterior. You are a remarkable woman, Lady Beatrice, he said, his voice softening slightly. You have endured much, and yet you still have the courage to fight. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers closing around hers. It was the first time he had touched her willingly, without the pretense of formality or necessity. His touch was warm, strong, reassuring. Beatrice felt a jolt of electricity run through her, a spark of connection that she had not expected. She looked at him, her eyes meeting his, and saw a flicker of something in his icy gaze, a hint of warmth, of admiration, of something more. He held her hand for a moment longer, then released it, his expression becoming guarded once more. We will begin tomorrow, he said, his voice businesslike. We will ride to Dunrobin Castle, to seek the counsel of Lord Sutherland. He is a powerful lord, and a man of honor. If anyone can help us, it is he. As Beatrice prepared for bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling of Moray's touch, the warmth that had lingered on her skin. She realized that her feelings for him had changed, had deepened. She no longer saw him simply as her protector, her captor. She saw him as a man, a complex, flawed, but ultimately honorable man. A man who had suffered his own losses, his own betrayals. A man with a scarred heart, capable of great strength and, perhaps, even of great love. The image of his hand on hers stayed with her as she drifted to sleep. A small comfort, but a significant one, amidst the turmoil. Chapter 13. The Lioness Roars. The journey to Dunrobin Castle was long and arduous, the landscape bleak and unforgiving. The wind howled across the snow-covered moors, and the sky was a perpetual gray, mirroring the mood of the travelers. Beatrice, despite her inner turmoil, rode with a newfound determination. She would not be broken by Edmund's betrayal, by the loss of her mother, by the challenges that lay ahead. She would fight for justice, for her own future, for the chance to finally be free. Moray rode beside her, his presence a silent source of strength. He spoke little, but his gaze often met hers, a silent acknowledgement of their shared purpose, their growing bond. He had shed some of his formal reserve, treating her with a respect, an almost gentle consideration that surprised and warmed her. They arrived at Dunrobin Castle at dusk, the imposing fortress silhouetted against the fading light. Lord Sutherland, a tall, powerfully built man with a mane of silver hair and piercing blue eyes, greeted them warmly. He was an old ally of Moray's, a man of honor and integrity, respected throughout the Highlands. After they had eaten and rested, Moray and Beatrice were summoned to Sutherland's private chamber. The room was richly furnished, with tapestries adorning the walls and a fire blazing in the hearth. Sutherland listened intently as Moray recounted the events of the past weeks, the escape from Blackmere, Father Michael's testimony, and the revelation of Edmund's treachery. When Moray finished, Sutherland turned to Beatrice, his gaze assessing. Lady Beatrice, he said, his voice deep and resonant. You have suffered much at the hands of your brother. I offer you my condolences and my support. Beatrice met his gaze, her chin lifted. Thank you, my lord, she said. But I do not seek pity. I seek justice. I want Edmund to pay for his crimes. Sutherland nodded, his expression approving. You are a woman of spirit, Lady Beatrice. A true lioness of the Highlands. I admire your courage. He paused, his gaze turning thoughtful. But bringing Edmund to justice will not be easy. He is a powerful lord, with many allies. And the evidence against him is circumstantial. The letter, Beatrice said, my mother's letter. It is proof of his guilt. A letter can be forged, Sutherland said. And witnesses can be silenced. We need more than that. We need irrefutable proof, or the support of a majority of the Highland lords. Then we must find that proof, Beatrice said, her voice firm. Or we must convince the lords to stand with us, despite the risks. It will be a dangerous undertaking, Sutherland said. Edmund will not hesitate to use force to protect himself. He has the support of Ashworth, and their combined forces are considerable. I am not afraid, Beatrice said. I have faced danger before. I will face it again. Sutherland smiled, a rare and genuine smile that lit up his face.
I see that you are indeed a lioness, Lady Beatrice. And I believe you are capable of great things. He turned to Moray. Geoffrey, my friend, you have found yourself a worthy ally. I will support you in this endeavor. I will call upon my own allies, and we will see if we can gather enough support to challenge Edmund. Moray nodded, his expression grateful. Thank you, Alistair. I knew I could count on you. But we must be cautious, Sutherland said. We must move slowly, discreetly. We cannot afford to alert Edmund to our plans. He must not suspect that we are gathering forces against him. They spent the next few days at Dunrobin, meeting with other lords who had been summoned by Sutherland. Beatrice played a crucial role in these meetings, telling her story with passion and conviction, her voice ringing with truth and outrage. She spoke of her mother's murder, of Edmund's tyranny, of Ashworth's cruelty. She appealed to their sense of justice, their honor, their loyalty to the Highlands. Some lords were hesitant, reluctant to risk their necks for a woman they barely knew. Others were more receptive, impressed by Beatrice's courage and determination. Slowly, gradually, they began to build a coalition, a force that could potentially challenge Edmund's power. Beatrice discovered a strength within herself that she had not known she possessed. She was no longer a timid, sheltered noblewoman. She was a leader, a strategist, a force to be reckoned with. She had found her voice, her purpose, her power. One evening, as she and Moray stood on the battlements of Dunrobin, overlooking the moonlit landscape, he turned to her, his gaze filled with admiration. You are magnificent today, Beatrice, he said, his voice low. You swayed them with your words, your passion, your unwavering belief in justice. Beatrice felt a flush of warmth spread through her. His praise meant more to her than she could say. I only spoke the truth, she said. It was not difficult. The truth is often the most difficult thing to speak, Moray said, especially when it is dangerous. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was warm, strong, sending a shiver of electricity through her. I am proud of you, Beatrice, he said, his voice husky. You have become more than I ever expected. Beatrice looked at him, her heart pounding. She saw in his eyes a reflection of her own feelings, a growing affection, a deepening respect, a spark of something more. She realized that she was falling in love with him, with the Winter Lord, the man who had offered her sanctuary, the man who had become her ally, her friend, her everything. The wind whipped around them, tugging at their cloaks, but they stood firm, their hands clasped together, their gazes locked. The moon, a silent witness to their growing bond, cast a silvery glow over them, illuminating the hope that had blossomed in the midst of darkness. It was a moment of profound connection, a silent vow exchanged between a lioness and her lord, a promise of a future they would face together, whatever the cost. Chapter 14. Flames in the Snow. Their fragile alliance, so carefully constructed at Dunrobin, was tested almost immediately. News arrived, carried by a breathless messenger, that Blackmere forces, led by Lord Ashworth himself, had crossed the border into Moray lands, raiding villages and burning farms. It was a clear act of aggression, a provocation designed to draw Moray into open conflict. Moray's response was swift and decisive. He gathered his men, preparing for battle. The atmosphere in the castle was tense, charged with the anticipation of violence. Men sharpened swords, donned armor, and spoke in hushed tones, their faces grim. Beatrice, despite her fear, refused to be sidelined. She insisted on being involved in the preparations, helping to organize supplies, tending to the wounded, and offering words of encouragement to the men. She had become a symbol of hope, of resilience, a reminder of what they were fighting for. Moray, though initially reluctant to allow her to be so close to the danger, eventually relented. He saw the strength in her, the determination, the unwavering commitment to their cause. He realized that she was not just a ward, a protected guest, but a true partner, an equal in this struggle. Before he rode out to meet Ashworth's forces, he sought her out. He found her in the chapel, kneeling in prayer, her face pale but composed. Beatrice, he said, his voice low. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Geoffrey," she said, her voice steady. "Be careful." He nodded, his gaze searching her face. "I will," he said. "But you must promise me something." "Anything," Beatrice said. "Stay safe," Moray said. "Do not take any unnecessary risks. I could not bear to lose you." His words, spoken with such raw emotion, took her breath away. She saw in his eyes a depth of feeling that she had not seen before, a vulnerability that he had always kept hidden. "I promise," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But you must promise me the same." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers closing around hers. His touch was warm, strong, sending a shiver of electricity through her. "I will come back to you, Beatrice," he said, his voice husky. "I swear it." He leaned down and kissed her, a brief, chaste kiss, but one filled with a depth of emotion that surprised them both. It was a kiss of farewell, of promise, of a love that had blossomed in the midst of conflict and danger. Then, he was gone, riding out with his men to meet the enemy. Beatrice watched them go, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and pride. She prayed for their safety, for their victory, for Moray's return. The battle was fierce and bloody, fought on a snow-covered field near the border. Beatrice, confined to the castle, could only imagine the horrors that were unfolding. She paced the battlements, her eyes scanning the horizon, her heart pounding with anxiety. The news arrived in fits and starts, carried by wounded soldiers who stumbled back to the castle. The fighting was intense, the outcome uncertain. Ashworth's forces were larger, better equipped, but Moray's men were fighting with the courage of desperation, defending their homes, their families, their land. As the day wore on, the news began to turn in Moray's favor. His men, though outnumbered, had fought with a ferocity that had surprised the enemy. They had used the terrain to their advantage, launching surprise attacks, harassing the enemy's flanks, and disrupting their supply lines. Finally, as dusk began to fall, a messenger arrived, bearing the news of victory. Ashworth's forces had been routed, scattered, their leader captured. Moray was returning, victorious, but wounded. Beatrice rushed to the courtyard, her heart pounding with relief and fear. She saw him then, riding through the gate, his armor battered and blood-stained, his face pale and drawn. He was slumped in the saddle, supported by Hamish, his loyal lieutenant. Beatrice ran to him, her eyes filling with tears. "Geoffrey," she cried, "you're alive." He managed a weak smile, his eyes meeting hers. "Beatrice," he whispered, "I told you I would come back." They carried him to his chamber, where Alara and Father Michael tended to his wounds. He had taken a blow to the shoulder, a deep gash that had bled profusely. He was weak, exhausted, but alive. Beatrice stayed by his side, holding his hand, wiping his brow, whispering words of comfort and encouragement. She watched over him as he slept, her heart filled with a love that was both fierce and tender. As the flames of the battle died down, replaced by the flickering candlelight in Moray's chamber, Beatrice knew that their trials were far from over. But she also knew that they would face them together, their love a beacon of hope in the midst of the darkness, a testament to the strength that could be found even in the heart of a winter's storm. The victory was a turning point, but the war for her future, and for justice, was far from won. Chapter 15. Echoes of Treachery. Moray's recovery was slow and painful. The wound to his shoulder had been deep, and infection threatened. Alara and Father Michael worked tirelessly, using all their skill and knowledge to tend to him, brewing potions, applying poultices, and changing bandages. Beatrice was constantly at his side, assisting them, offering comfort, and willing him to live. During his periods of lucidity, Moray spoke of the battle, of the courage of his men, of the capture of Ashworth. He also spoke of his concern for the future, for the inevitable retaliation from Edmund. "He will not let this stand," Moray said, his voice weak but firm. "He will come for us, with all his force. We must be prepared." "We will be," Beatrice said, her voice steady. "We have allies now. Lord Sutherland, and the others, they will stand with us." "Allies are fickle," Moray said. They can be swayed by fear, by greed, by promises of power. We cannot rely on them entirely. He looked at her, his gaze intense. We must find a way to end this, Beatrice. To bring Edmund to justice, before he destroys everything we have fought for. Beatrice nodded, her mind racing. She knew that he was right. They could not simply wait for Edmund to attack. They had to find a way to strike first, to weaken him, to expose his crimes to the world. She remembered the hidden door in the library, the overheard conversation between Moray and Gareth, the talk of a plan, of a risk. She had never had the opportunity to ask him about it, but now, she felt, was the time. Geoffrey, she said, her voice hesitant. There is something I need to ask you. Something I overheard. Before the battle, she told him about the hidden door, about the whispered conversation, about the sense that he was hiding something from her. Moray was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. Then, he sighed, a deep, weary sigh. You are too perceptive, Beatrice, he said. I had hoped to keep this from you, to protect you from the ugliness of it all. I am not a child, Geoffrey, Beatrice said. I deserve to know the truth, whatever it is. He explained his plan, a plan that involved using Ashworth as a pawn in their game. Ashworth, now their prisoner, had revealed a crucial piece of information, a secret alliance between Edmund and a powerful English lord, the Earl of Warwick. Warwick, ambitious and ruthless, had long coveted the lands of the Scottish Highlands and had been secretly supplying Edmund with weapons and men. Moray's plan was to expose this alliance, to reveal Edmund's treachery to the other Highland lords and to the Scottish king himself. If they could prove that Edmund was conspiring with the English, he would be branded a traitor, stripped of his lands and titles, and brought to justice. It is a dangerous game, Moray said. If we are discovered, if Warwick learns of our plan, it could mean war, not just with Edmund, but with England itself. But it is our only hope, Beatrice said. We must take the risk. Moray nodded, his expression grim. We will send a message to the king, he said. We will present him with the evidence and demand that he take action against Edmund. The message was drafted, carefully worded, outlining the evidence against Edmund, the testimony of Father Michael, the captured Ashworth's confession, and the threat of English intervention. It was sealed with Moray's crest and entrusted to a trusted messenger, a young man named Ewan, known for his speed and discretion. As they waited for the king's response, the tension within the castle grew. They knew that they were walking a tightrope, that one wrong move could send them plummeting into the abyss. One evening, as Beatrice was sitting with Moray in his chamber, reading to him from a book of ancient ballads, they heard a commotion outside. The door burst open, and Hamish entered, his face pale and drawn. My lord, he said, his voice urgent. Ewan, he has been found. Murdered. The message, it is gone. Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. Betrayal. Someone within Moray's own household had betrayed them, had alerted Edmund to their plan, and had murdered the messenger to silence him. Moray's face was a mask of fury. Who? He demanded. Who could have done this? Hamish shook his head, his eyes filled with despair. We do not know, my lord. There are no witnesses, no clues. Only this. He held out a small, intricately carved wooden dagger, its blade stained with blood. Beatrice recognized it immediately. It was Ailsa's, the stern-faced woman from the kitchens, the one who had always regarded Beatrice with suspicion. The echoes of treachery reverberated through the castle, a serpent's kiss delivered not from Blackmere, but from within their own walls. The discovery left them reeling, their trust shattered, their plans in ruins, and their future hanging precariously in the balance. The enemy was not just at the gates, but amongst them, hidden in plain sight. Chapter 16. The Hunter and the Hunted. The discovery of Ailsa's dagger sent a wave of shock and disbelief through the castle. Ailsa, a trusted member of the household, a woman who had worked alongside them for years, how could she have betrayed them? Moray, despite his weakened state, was consumed by a cold fury. He ordered Ailsa's immediate arrest, and she was brought before him in the great hall, her hands bound, her face defiant. Ailsa, Moray said, his voice low and dangerous. You stand accused of treason, of murder. Do you deny these charges? Ailsa met his gaze, her chin lifted. I do, she said, her voice steady. I am no traitor. I am loyal to Moray, to my clan. Then, how do you explain this? Moray demanded, holding up the blood-stained dagger. This is your dagger, is it not? It was found near Ewan's body. It is my dagger, Ailsa admitted. But I did not kill Ewan. I swear it on my life. Your life is forfeit, Moray said, his voice harsh. Unless you tell me the truth. Who ordered you to do this? Who are you working for? Ailsa was silent, her gaze unwavering. She refused to answer, to betray her accomplice, to reveal the secrets she held. Moray tried everything. He threatened, he pleaded, he promised leniency. But Ailsa remained steadfast, her silence a wall of defiance. Beatrice, watching the interrogation, felt a growing sense of unease. Something didn't feel right. Ailsa's demeanor, her unwavering denial, her refusal to implicate anyone else that didn't fit with the profile of a traitor. She remembered Ailsa's sharp tongue, her initial suspicion of Beatrice, but she also remembered her grudging respect, her willingness to work alongside her in the kitchens, her loyalty to Moray. Could she have been framed? She approached Moray, her voice low.
Geoffrey, she said.
I do not believe Ailsa is guilty. I think she is protecting someone. Moray looked at her, his eyes filled with frustration and anger. She is the only suspect, Beatrice. The evidence is clear. But her behavior, Beatrice argued. It doesn't make sense. She is too loyal, too proud to betray you. Loyalty can be a mask, Moray said. And pride can be a weapon. We cannot afford to be sentimental, Beatrice. We must be ruthless. But what if we are wrong? Beatrice pleaded. What if we condemn an innocent woman, while the real traitor goes free? Moray hesitated, his gaze searching her face. He saw the doubt in her eyes, the plea for justice, the unwavering belief in the possibility of innocence. He sighed, a deep, weary sigh. Very well, he said. We will investigate further. But if we find no other evidence, Ailsa will face the consequences. Beatrice, relieved, set about her own investigation. She spoke to the other servants, to the guards, to anyone who might have seen or heard something. She searched Ailsa's chamber, looking for any clue, any hint of her involvement. She found nothing. No incriminating letters, no hidden gold, no sign of any contact with the outside world. Ailsa's chamber was as Spartan and unremarkable as any other servant's quarters. Then she remembered something. Ailsa had a son, a young boy named Colin, who worked in the stables. She had often seen them together, Ailsa doting on her son, her face softening with a love that was rarely seen. She found Colin in the stables, tending to the horses. He was a quiet, withdrawn boy, his eyes filled with fear and confusion. Colin, Beatrice said, her voice gentle. I need to ask you some questions. About your mother. Colin looked at her, his eyes widening in alarm. My mother, she did nothing wrong, he said, his voice trembling. I know, Beatrice said. But someone is trying to frame her. Someone is trying to make her look guilty. You can help me find the truth. Colin hesitated, his gaze darting around nervously. He was clearly terrified, torn between his loyalty to his mother and his fear of the consequences. Please, Colin, Beatrice said. Your mother's life is in danger. You are the only one who can save her. Finally, Colin broke down, his tears flowing freely. He confessed that he had seen his mother meeting with someone, a man he didn't recognize, a man who had given her a small bag of gold. He had overheard them talking, whispering about a message, about a betrayal. Who was the man? Beatrice asked, her voice urgent. Colin shook his head, his eyes filled with terror. I don't know, he said. But I saw him give my mother something. A piece of parchment. She hid it in her sewing basket. Beatrice raced back to Ailsa's chamber, her heart pounding. She found the sewing basket, a small, wicker container filled with needles, thread, and scraps of fabric. She rummaged through it, her fingers trembling. And there it was, a small, folded piece of parchment, hidden beneath a pile of linen.
Beatrice unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words. It was a letter, written in a familiar hand. A hand she had seen before, on the letter sent to Father Michael. The hand of Gareth, Moray's trusted lieutenant, the man who had led the rescue mission to Blackmere. The hunter had become the hunted. The revelation was a stunning blow, turning their world upside down and leaving Beatrice with a chilling realization that the treachery ran far deeper and closer to Moray's heart than she could ever have imagined. The implications were staggering, and the danger, far from receding, had only intensified. Chapter 17. Where Shadows Gather. The discovery of Gareth's letter sent a shockwave through Beatrice's very core. Gareth, Moray's trusted lieutenant, the man who had fought by his side for years, the man who had led the mission to rescue Father Michael, a traitor? It seemed impossible, unbelievable. But the evidence was irrefutable. The letter, written in Gareth's distinctive hand, detailed his plans to betray Moray, to deliver Beatrice to Edmund, and to sabotage the alliance with the other Highland lords. It spoke of a secret meeting with Ashworth, of a promised reward, of a plan to assassinate Moray during the upcoming gathering of the clans. Beatrice felt a wave of nausea, of disbelief, of overwhelming dread. How could this have happened? How could Moray, so astute, so perceptive, have been so completely deceived? She knew she had to tell him, immediately, but she also knew that the news would devastate him. Gareth was not just a lieutenant, he was a friend, a confidant, someone Moray trusted implicitly. She found Moray in his chamber, resting, his shoulders still bandaged, his face pale and drawn. He looked up as she entered, his eyes questioning. "Beatrice," he said, his voice weak. "What is it? What has happened?" She hesitated, her heart pounding. How to break this news? How to shatter his trust, his faith in one of his closest companions? She took a deep breath and told him, her voice trembling, her words tumbling out in a rush. She showed him the letter, explaining how she had found it, how Colin had revealed his mother's involvement, how Ailsa had been protecting her son, not betraying her lord. Moray listened in silence, his face growing increasingly pale, his eyes hardening with a cold fury. He took the letter from her, his fingers trembling, and read it himself, his lips moving silently as he absorbed the words. When he finished, he looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of disbelief and rage. "Gareth?" he whispered. "It cannot be. He was like a brother to me." "I know," Beatrice said, her voice gentle. "But the evidence is clear. He is the traitor." Moray stood up, his body swaying slightly. He paced the room, his hands clenched into fists, his mind clearly reeling.
"Why?"
he said, his voice raw with emotion. Why would he do this? What could have driven him to such treachery? "The letter speaks of a reward," Beatrice said. "Of a promise of land and power. Edmund must have offered him something irresistible. But Gareth, he was not a greedy man," Moray said. "He was loyal, honorable, or so I believed." He stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, agonizing pain. "I have been a fool, Beatrice," he said. "I have trusted the wrong people. I have made mistakes that have cost lives. I have endangered everything we have fought for." Beatrice reached out and took his hand, her fingers closing around his. His touch was cold, his hand trembling. "You are not a fool, Geoffrey," she said, her voice firm. "You are a good man, a just man, a man who has been betrayed by someone you trusted. It is not your fault. But it is my responsibility," Moray said. "I am the Lord of Moray. I am responsible for the safety of my people, for the protection of my lands. And I have failed." "You have not failed," Beatrice said. "You have fought bravely, you have protected me, you have rallied your allies. And we will continue to fight. We will expose Gareth's treachery, we will bring Edmund to justice, and we will win this war." Her words, spoken with such conviction, seemed to reach him. He looked at her, his gaze searching her face, and saw the strength in her eyes, the determination, the unwavering belief in him. He squeezed her hand, a faint smile touching his lips. "You are right, Beatrice," he said. "We will not give up. We will fight. And we will win."
They spent the rest of the day planning their next move. They decided to keep Gareth's treachery a secret, for now, to avoid causing panic and division within the castle. They would confront him, privately, and try to extract a confession, to learn the full extent of his plans, and to discover if he had any other accomplices. As darkness fell, they summoned Gareth to the library, the place where so many secrets had been revealed, where so many plans had been hatched. The room was dimly lit, with only a single candle flickering on the table, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Gareth entered, his expression unsuspecting, his demeanor confident. He greeted Moray with a respectful bow, his eyes flicking towards Beatrice with a hint of curiosity.
"My lord," he said.
"You summoned me?" Moray nodded, his face impassive. "Yes, Gareth," he said. "We have something to discuss. Something important." The shadows gathered, thick and ominous, around them, as Moray prepared to confront the man he had once called friend, the man who had betrayed him, the man who now stood before him, unsuspecting, on the precipice of exposure. The air was heavy with unspoken accusations, with the weight of betrayal, with the chilling knowledge that the battle for Moray, for Beatrice's future, had just taken a devastating, personal turn. Chapter 18. A Dawn of Reckoning. Moray wasted no time with pleasantries. He held out Gareth's letter, the damning evidence of his treachery, the words stark and unforgiving in the flickering candlelight. "Do you recognize this, Gareth?" Moray asked, his voice cold, devoid of any emotion. Gareth's eyes widened slightly as he saw the letter, his face paling beneath his tan. He glanced at Beatrice, then back at Moray, his composure momentarily faltering. "My lord," he stammered, his voice losing its usual confidence. "It is your handwriting, is it not?" Moray pressed, his gaze unwavering. "Your words, your plans, your betrayal." Gareth hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, as if seeking an escape, a way out of the trap that had been laid for him. But there was no escape. The evidence was clear, the accusation irrefutable. Finally, he slumped, his shoulders sagging, his defiance crumbling. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "It is mine." "Why, Gareth?" Moray asked, his voice raw with a mixture of anger and pain. "Why would you do this? We have fought together, bled together, trusted each other."
"Why?"
Gareth looked up at him, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions: shame, regret, fear, and something else, a flicker of defiance, perhaps, or even justification. "I did it for my family, my lord," he said, his voice gaining strength. "For my children. For their future." "What do you mean?" Moray demanded. Gareth explained, his words tumbling out in a rush, his story a tangled web of ambition, desperation, and coercion. He spoke of his debts, of his fear of losing his land, of Edmund's offer of wealth and power in exchange for his loyalty. He spoke of Ashworth's threats, of the danger to his family if he refused to cooperate. "Edmund promised me a position of power," Gareth said. "He promised me land, wealth, a future for my children. He said that you were weak, that you would lose this war, that Moray would fall to the English." "And you believed him?" Moray asked, his voice incredulous. I didn't know what to believe," Gareth said. "I was afraid, my lord. I was desperate. I saw no other way." "You could have come to me," Moray said, his voice filled with a deep, agonizing disappointment. "You could have trusted me. We could have found another way." "I know that now," Gareth said, his voice filled with regret. "But it is too late. I have made my choice, and I must face the consequences." He looked at Beatrice, his eyes pleading. "I am sorry, Lady Beatrice," he said.
"For my part in this."
"For the danger I have put you in." Beatrice met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She felt a mixture of anger, pity, and understanding. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the fear that had driven him to make such a terrible choice. "What is done," she said, her voice steady. "But you can still help us, Gareth. You can tell us everything. Edmund's plans, Ashworth's intentions, the names of any other accomplices." Gareth hesitated, his gaze flickering back to Moray. He knew that revealing this information would mean his own death,
But he also knew that it was the only way to redeem himself, to atone for his betrayal. He nodded, his decision made. "I will tell you everything," he said. He spent the next hour detailing Edmund's plans, revealing the full extent of his treachery, the scope of his alliance with the English, and the planned assassination attempt on Moray's life. He named names, exposed secrets, and laid bare the web of deceit that had been spun around them. When he finished, the room was silent, the weight of his confession hanging heavy in the air. Moray looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "You have betrayed me, Gareth," Moray said. "You have betrayed your clan, your people, your oaths. But you have also shown remorse, and you have offered us a chance to stop Edmund, to save Moray." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I cannot forgive your treachery," he said. "But I can offer you a measure of respect. For your honesty, for your willingness to help us, even at the cost of your own life." Gareth nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, my lord," he whispered. "I am ready to face my punishment." Moray turned to Beatrice, his expression questioning. He was giving her a choice, a chance to influence his decision, a recognition of her role in this, of her growing power within his household. Beatrice met his gaze, her heart heavy. She knew what had to be done. Justice demanded it. But she also felt a pang of sympathy for Gareth, for the man who had been driven to betrayal by fear and desperation. "He has told us everything," she said, her voice steady. "He has given us the information we need to defeat Edmund. But he is still a traitor, and his crimes cannot go unpunished." She paused, her gaze flickering to Gareth, who met her eyes with a resigned acceptance. "I leave his fate in your hands, Sir Geoffrey," she said. "You are the Lord of Moray. You must decide." Moray nodded, his expression grim. He knew what he had to do. He could not show mercy, not to a traitor who had endangered so many lives. But he could offer him a swift, clean death, a death with dignity. "Gareth," Moray said, his voice firm, "you will be executed at dawn." As a traitor to Moray, he met Gareth's accepting gaze, the finality of the decree ringing clear. The dawn would bring a reckoning, not just for Gareth, but for the entire conflict that had engulfed them, a turning point brought about by betrayal, confession, and the agonizing choices that had to be made in the name of justice and survival. The weight of leadership, of love, and of loss settled heavily on Moray and Beatrice as they prepared for the coming day. Chapter 19. The Weight of Crowns. The execution of Gareth, carried out with solemn ceremony in the courtyard at dawn, cast a pall over Moray. Despite his treachery, he had been one of them, a member of their community, a man who had once fought alongside them. His death served as a stark reminder of the stakes, of the cost of betrayal, of the fragility of trust. With Gareth's information, Moray and Beatrice finalized their plans to expose Edmund's treachery and bring him to justice. They sent a second message to the Scottish king, this time carried by Hamish himself, accompanied by a small contingent of Moray's most trusted men. The message included not only Gareth's confession, but also a captured English soldier, a witness to Edmund's alliance with Warwick. The wait for the king's response was agonizing. They knew that Edmund would be moving quickly, consolidating his forces, preparing for a final, desperate assault. Time was running out. During this tense period, Beatrice and Moray grew even closer. They spent hours together, discussing strategy, sharing their fears, and finding solace in each other's company. The bond between them had deepened, forged in the crucible of conflict and betrayal, tempered by mutual respect and a growing, undeniable love. One evening, as they sat by the fire in Moray's chamber, he turned to her, his gaze filled with a tenderness that she had never seen before. "Beatrice," he said, his voice low and husky, "I have been thinking about us." Beatrice's heart skipped a beat. She met his gaze, her own feelings mirroring his. "I have been thinking about us too, Geoffrey," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was warm, strong, sending a shiver of electricity through her. "I know that this is not the time," he said. "With so much uncertainty, So much danger, but I cannot deny my feelings any longer. He paused, his gaze searching her face.
I have come to love you, Beatrice, he said.
Deeply, fiercely, irrevocably. Tears welled up in Beatrice's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. And I love you, Geoffrey, she said, her voice trembling. With all my heart. He leaned in and kissed her a long, passionate kiss, a kiss that sealed their love, their commitment, their shared destiny. It was a kiss that spoke of hope, of resilience, of a future they would build together, whatever the cost. Their moment of intimacy was interrupted by a commotion outside. The door burst open, and Hamish entered, his face beaming with excitement. "My lord, my lady," he exclaimed. "The king has arrived, with a large contingent of his own men." The news sent a wave of relief and anticipation through them. The king's arrival meant that their message had been received, that their evidence had been believed, that justice was finally within reach. They rushed to the courtyard, where King James, a tall, imposing figure in regal attire, was dismounting from his horse. He greeted Moray warmly, his expression grave. "Sir Geoffrey," the king said, "I have received your message, and I have seen the evidence. Edmund's treachery is undeniable." He turned to Beatrice, his gaze softening slightly. "Lady Beatrice," he said, "you have suffered much at the hands of your brother. I offer you my condolences and my assurance that justice will be served." "Thank you, your majesty," Beatrice said, her voice filled with gratitude. The king then announced his decision. He declared Edmund a traitor, stripped him of his lands and titles, and ordered his immediate arrest. He also announced his intention to marry Beatrice to Moray, uniting their two houses, strengthening the defenses of the Highlands, and ensuring a lasting peace. The announcement was met with cheers from Moray's men, and with a sense of profound relief from Beatrice. She looked at Moray, her eyes shining with love and happiness. He smiled at her, his own eyes reflecting her joy. But their triumph was short-lived. As the king was finishing his pronouncement, a scout arrived, his face pale and terrified. "My lord king," he shouted, "Edmund's forces are approaching. They are attacking the castle." Edmund, desperate and defiant, had launched a final, all-out assault on Moray, hoping to seize victory from the jaws of defeat. The weight of crowns, of power, of ambition, had driven him to a final, desperate act of aggression. The battle for Moray, for Beatrice's future, for the fate of the Highlands, had reached its climax. The joy was swallowed up by the immediate threat, the celebration cut short by the blare of war horns. Chapter 20. Beyond the Winter's Embrace. The final battle for Moray was swift and brutal. Edmund's forces, fueled by desperation and a thirst for revenge, attacked with a ferocity that surprised even Moray's seasoned warriors. But they were met with an equally fierce resistance, bolstered by the king's men and inspired by the presence of Beatrice, who refused to remain hidden, instead moving among the defenders, offering encouragement and tending to the wounded. Moray, despite his recent injury, fought with the strength and skill of a seasoned warrior, his leadership inspiring his men to fight harder, to push back the enemy, to defend their homes, their families, their land. He moved through the battle like a wraith, his sword flashing in the sunlight, his voice ringing out above the din, directing his forces, rallying his troops. Beatrice, watching him from the battlements, felt a surge of pride and love. He was magnificent, a true warrior, a true leader, a man worthy of her love, of her respect, of her unwavering loyalty. The fighting raged for hours, the outcome uncertain. Edmund's forces, though outnumbered, were well-equipped and driven by a desperate hope of victory. They pushed hard, forcing Moray's men to retreat, to give ground, to fight for every inch of their territory. But then, the tide began to turn. The king's men, fresh and well-trained, launched a counterattack, pushing back Edmund's forces, driving them from the field. Edmund, seeing his hopes of victory slipping away, fought with a renewed ferocity, his eyes filled with a madman's rage. He sought out Moray, his intention clear to kill his rival, to end this conflict once and for all. They met in the midst of the battle, their swords clashing in a shower of sparks, their bodies locked in a deadly embrace. Beatrice, watching from the battlements, held her breath, her heart pounding with fear. She saw Edmund's sword strike Moray's arm, drawing blood. She cried out, her voice lost in the din of the battle. But Moray, fueled by adrenaline and a fierce determination to protect his people, to protect Beatrice, fought on. He parried Edmund's blows, dodged his attacks, and finally, with a swift, decisive move, disarmed him. Edmund stood before him, defeated, his sword lying at his feet, his eyes filled with hatred and despair. "It is over, Edmund," Moray said, his voice cold and steady. "Surrender." Edmund refused. He lunged at Moray, his hands reaching for his throat, his intention clear to kill him, even in defeat. But Moray was faster. He raised his sword and, with a single, swift blow, ended Edmund's life. The battle was over. Moray had won. Edmund was dead. The threat to their future, to their love, had been extinguished. Beatrice rushed to him, her eyes filled with tears of relief and joy. She embraced him, holding him tight, her body trembling with emotion. "Geoffrey," she whispered, "you're alive. You're safe." He held her close, his arms wrapping around her, his face buried in her hair. "Beatrice," he said, his voice husky, "it is over. We are safe. We are free." The aftermath of the battle was a time of both mourning and celebration. They mourned the loss of their fallen comrades, they celebrated their victory, and they began the long, arduous process of rebuilding their lives, their homes, their future. Edmund's body was returned to Blackmere, along with Ashworth, who was handed over to the king's justice to face trial for his crimes. The alliance with Warwick was exposed, and the English lord, facing the wrath of his own king, withdrew his support, leaving the Highlands to their own devices. Moray and Beatrice were married in the spring, in a simple but beautiful ceremony in the chapel at Moray. The king himself gave Beatrice away, and the entire clan, along with their allies from Dunrobin and other Highland strongholds, celebrated their union. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, a promise of a future filled with hope, with love, with the possibility of peace. The Winter Lord had found his spring, his warmth, his reason to thaw the ice that had surrounded his heart for so long. And Beatrice, the falcon who had fled her gilded cage, had found her true home, her true love, her true freedom, beyond the winter's embrace, in the arms of the man who had saved her, who had loved her, who had shown her the true meaning of courage, of loyalty, of unwavering devotion. They were bound not only by law, not only by duty, but also by a love forged in fire and ice. Epilogue. The years that followed were kind to Moray and Beatrice. The wounds of war, both physical and emotional, slowly healed. The land prospered, the people thrived, and the memory of Edmund's tyranny faded into the mists of time. Beatrice, no longer the timid, sheltered noblewoman, blossomed into a strong, capable leader, ruling alongside Moray with wisdom, compassion, and a fierce determination to protect her people. She became known throughout the Highlands as the Lioness of Moray, a woman of courage, of resilience, of unwavering loyalty. She bore Moray 2 children, a son, Alastair, named after Lord Sutherland, and a daughter, Fiona, named after Moray's deceased wife, a gesture of respect and reconciliation with his past. The children grew up strong and healthy, surrounded by love, by laughter, by the stories of their parents' bravery and their enduring love. Moray, his heart thawed by Beatrice's love, became a more just and compassionate ruler. He never forgot the lessons he had learned, the cost of betrayal, the importance of trust, the fragility of peace. He ruled with a firm hand, but also with a gentle heart, always mindful of the needs of his people. The hidden door in the library, once a symbol of secrets and treachery, was sealed shut, its purpose served, its darkness banished. The library itself became a place of learning, of shared stories, of quiet moments between husband and wife, a sanctuary where their love continued to grow and deepen. The locket Beatrice brought on her flight, with the tiny braid of her lost sister's hair, was finally joined with another. She opened her mother's locket she wore, which had remained empty. Now, a lock of Moray's dark hair rested inside. Past and present, all those she loved, were with her. As the years passed, their hair turned silver, their bodies grew weaker, but their love remained as strong as ever. They would often walk together on the battlements, overlooking the snow-covered landscape, remembering the trials they had faced, the battles they had won, the love they had found. One winter evening, as the snow fell softly outside, Beatrice sat by the fire in their chamber, her hand clasped in Moray's. He was old now, his body frail, his breathing shallow, but his eyes, those icy blue eyes that had once held so much sadness, now shone with a deep, abiding love. "Beatrice," he whispered, his voice weak, but filled with emotion. "My love, my life, my everything." Beatrice leaned down and kissed him, a gentle, tender kiss, a kiss that spoke of a lifetime of love, of shared joys and sorrows, of a bond that could never be broken. "Geoffrey," she whispered back. "My winter lord, my heart, my forever." He smiled, a faint, peaceful smile, and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, then stopped. He was gone. Beatrice held him close, her tears falling silently onto his face. She grieved for him, deeply, profoundly, but she also felt a sense of peace, of gratitude, of knowing that he was finally at rest, free from the pain, the burdens, the ghosts of his past. She lived for many years after Moray's death, ruling Moray with wisdom and compassion, guiding her children, watching her grandchildren grow. She never remarried, her heart forever belonging to the Winter Lord, the man who had saved her, who had loved her, who had shown her the true meaning of courage, of loyalty, of enduring love. And when, at long last, her own time came, she was laid to rest beside him, in the small chapel at Moray, their tombs facing each other, their names inscribed together, their love story a legend that would be told and retold throughout the Highlands for generations to come. The Lioness and the Winter Lord, together forever, beyond the reach of winter's cold embrace, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of the human spirit to endure, to overcome, to find love and happiness even in the darkest of times. The end.